Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2023 documentary Monster Inside, America's Most Extreme Haunted House. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this documentary, I would like to give a special shout out to my good friend Matt, Rambaraf for Life, for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, Monster Inside is a documentary about the infamous McKamey Manor and the originator of this torture chamber, Russ McKamey, as well as the various different victims, as well as fans of this infamous haunt. And I didn't even know this was a documentary or this was even out until my friend requested it. And I was honestly really curious about it because I had seen a couple different YouTube videos in the past about McKamey Manor. I thought they were pretty well done. So I felt that it was a topic that was ripe for a documentary. I feel that it could have been something really special if it was done right. And I didn't hate this by any means, but I did find it to be just in the middle. Like, I thought this was just okay. And I think that it's a little bit of a letdown considering the fact that I think there's so much more to the story and there's so much more details and layers that the documentary didn't even attempt to showcase. And as a result, it's just one of those documentaries that it was an interesting watch at least once, but it's not something that I really would watch again. It's directed by a guy who had done a lot of direct-to-video independent films prior to this, but he wasn't, let's just say, like a really well-known indie filmmaker. But he did a couple low-budget independent films. His name is Andrew Renzi, and he also did a bunch of other documentaries for Hulu. And his direction here and his documentary style, it's not bad. It works for what they're trying to do here. It's effectively mysterious and eerie and creepy at times. I think he really did some nice work when it comes to the mood lighting with certain interviewees, and he did the best that he could with what little that he had to work with when it comes to the narrative. The narrative is very threadbare, and so considering what he was working with, I think he did a pretty solid job. It's not what I would consider to be particularly standout direction for a documentary, but it's solid. It's maybe not anything particularly special, but it's effective nonetheless. Now, the film doesn't necessarily have a script. It's more just a bunch of interviews that are spliced together to form some kind of a loose narrative. And the narrative here, it's very threadbare. Because once you get past the initial, oh, we're letting you know about this McKamey Manor. Here's a brief history of the McKamey Manor and Russ McKamey and where he started from, which was honestly humble, wholesome beginnings. He started out as a guy who just loved horror and loved Halloween and made really expensive and creative haunts for the neighborhood. And he even involved kids, and it was a genuinely fun and relatively harmless experience. Seemed like the only damage that Russ was doing at that time was to his own pocketbook because he just spent thousands and thousands of dollars every year on these haunts. But at a certain point, things just twisted, and then he decided to make it into more of an extreme thing. And because of the popularity of stuff like Saw and Hostel at the time, he decided to I wouldn't say intentionally because that's not the right word to use. Uh, but he decided to create a torture dungeon, basically. He created McKamey Manor and made it into a grueling experience of psychological and physical torture and abuse, and marketed it as the most extreme horror haunt in America. And in its heyday, it was genuinely extreme. There were people who worked with him, who took part in the extreme nature and the torture, and were working alongside him, and it became viral for a certain amount of time. And knowing that a lot of people are into becoming internet famous, it attracted a lot of people to go to the manor, and a lot of people uh, had a harrowing and just insane experience. As with anything like this, people's opinions varied. Some people were like, "Oh, this is awesome, this is great." I don't think the documentary focused on that side enough, because that's fascinating to me. That's equally as interesting to me as the individuals who went through McKamey Manor and suffered and had a lot of psychological damage as well as physical damage done to them. But the people who went through it and were like, "That was awesome. That was the best haunt I've ever been on. I would do it again." Like, I would like to get a little bit. I wanted to get their perspective, and you didn't get that. I would have liked to have seen the perspective of the people who worked as volunteers for the haunt. You had some people that were interviewed early on who worked with Russ in the early stages of the manor, but you didn't have anybody who was like one of his right hand men who were involved with like locking people in freezers and tying people up and doing all this other sort of stuff. It would have been nice to have seen their perspective on their whole experience with Russ, whether it was positive or negative. As a result, the documentary, it just felt like it didn't have as much detail and as much depth as it could have, and it made it pretty one-sided. I know the filmmakers, they tried to interview Russ, but he was non-committal. He refused. Even though they did talk to him through email and whatever, he ultimately decided not to do interviews for the documentary. So you didn't have his side of the story except for uh, various different clips and interviews that they got from social media and other sources. So a lot of the information and detail in the documentary, if you're familiar with McKamey Manor at all, this is not anything new. So it takes a bit for it to get into moments where you feel like you're hearing something different. And a lot of that just really has to do with these competing stream haunts like Miasma. That was honestly one of my favorite parts of the documentary, is when it focused on Miasma and the creator of that. And it provided this contrast between McKamey's torture dungeon and Miasma, where it's intense and it's not for everybody, but the guy knows what he's doing and he actually cares about people and doesn't want them to be damaged psychologically or physically. Like, they have a safe word. They can quit the experience anytime that they want. And he's very cognizant of that. And Russ, on the other hand, just doesn't give a shit. He just flips a switch and he's like fucking John Wayne Gacy or some shit. Like, the guy is just a straight up serial killer at that moment. And a lot of the documentary is padding as well, like interviews with Brandon and his therapist, or just straight up therapy sessions with Brandon and his therapist. Interviews with people who loosely connect to the topic, like this woman who works at Guantanamo Bay, who's an expert in torture. Interview her for like a couple minutes and have her thoughts on McKamey Manor, and that's it. There's this other guy who is a therapist for extreme kinks and and also other extreme sort of uh, exhibitionist sort of things. And he speaks for a couple minutes on the topic, but doesn't really add a whole lot of anything other than, oh, I'm a psychologist, I'm a therapist who specializes in people who are into weird shit. It's like, okay, all right, cool. Anything else to add? Like, no, all right. And the bulk of the documentary is just these interviews with various different people who worked with Russ or were contestants, or contestants isn't really the right word. Um, they were victims of his torture dungeon or his torture farm. Melissa, Gabi, Kris, and Brandon. Kris, I would say, is the one that provided the most interesting dynamic because of the fact that he was once really close with Russ. And so you get that perspective, how, this is a guy who worked with Russ, who helped set up a lot of haunts, was on his side, was defending him from people who were going after him when the controversies were really starting to arise when it comes to McKamey Manor. And even he didn't want anything to do with him at a certain point because Russ took things too far, even with him. The scene that they show in the documentary where Kris is being buried alive and he's telling his friend to stop and his friend just keeps piling it on is genuinely horrifying. Melissa, she is also the one that I would say is arguably featured the most in the documentary because she had not just one experience with Russ, but she had two. So she not only willingly went through this torture once, but she went through it a second time. And you definitely do feel for her, especially if it is true that Russ did something to her when she was unconscious the second time around. And her whole story really did spark an interesting internal discussion or conversation or a series of questions in my head while I was watching it about what people are willing to do and how far they're going to go for internet fame and for clout, because she kept pushing herself farther and farther because she had this fan base that she got due to the live streams of her going through McKamey Manor and Russ detailing everything that she's going through on social media the second time around. And it's interesting to think about like how far an individual is willing to go. Are they willing to essentially exhaust and um, torture themselves for that very reason? Uh, and speaking of interesting conversations and thoughts and stuff like that, I like the portions of the documentary that make you think about why these people do something like this extreme haunt or why they do extreme haunts in the first place. It makes them feel more like real people, and it does add some extra depth to the documentary because of the fact that you don't have a lot of different perspectives. Just have the perspective of the people who went through the haunt or worked with him, or in Gabi's case, went through the haunt and worked with him afterwards and was working on his social media and was doing all this other stuff. It does get a little repetitive, I have to be honest. Um, But there is a nice dynamic of people with different reasons why they went there and different experiences. Like Brandon, who is a military vet who has PTSD, and he does a lot of these extreme haunts and a lot of this other stuff because it's a way for him to provide a release of these emotions and all of this stuff that he's dealing with. And you also have other people like this one guy who became an enemy of Russ after he was initially a big fan. Like, he loved it, he was into it, and he wanted to experience the manor for himself. And he went to Russ's farm and went through the whole thing. And Russ just humiliated him, and because of the fact that he wasn't submissive during the whole thing, Russ just kicked him out, and that pissed him off. So then he decided to crusade against Russ and created anti McKamey Manor groups on Facebook and hacked into his computer and got his emails. So that was a nice bit of added drama that the documentary threw in there that definitely sparked a little more extra interest for me. But like I said, a lot of stuff just runs together. You have a lot of padding with interviews with people who barely or loosely connected to things. A lot of footage from various different horror films because, oh, these people were into horror films, so that's why they even wanted to do this in the first place, because they want to live through a horror film. I love horror. It's my favorite film genre, but I do not want to live through a horror movie. No thanks. And all of that being said, there's so much detail and there's so many things that are just completely left out, or the writers or the people behind it didn't even think about it. So, ironically, by the end of this, it comes across more like a documentary. Instead of outright condemning and pointing out how ridiculous and how much of a manipulative liar and just total freak show and psycho Russ is, they, by the end of it, because they sensationalize things so much, they make it appealing to people who are interested in that kind of thing. It makes them look at that and be like, oh, yeah, hell yeah, I want that experience. I want to do that. Look at all these other people who are talking about how it was just so awesome and unique and crazy. I want that, and you know, I want to win that $20,000. And I think it's misleading, and that's one aspect of the film I really don't care for, is because it doesn't tell the full story. There's a YouTuber named Reckless Ben who made a whole series, I think it's still ongoing, where he exposes McKamey Manor. And a lot of the stuff that he details in those videos is so much more in depth and so much more detailed than what you get in this documentary. Because it almost felt like behind the scenes, Russ was kind of there with this documentary. Like, hey, I don't want you to make me look too bad. I don't want you to make McKamey Manor look like it's a total joke now. You got to hype it up still. And that's what they did. But in reality, McKamey Manor now is an absolute pathetic joke. It's a pathetic, sad old man with a lot of mental health issues who takes advantage of people and their own mental issues and abuses them. But before, it used to be very theatrical. It used to be something that was just honestly pretty insane in terms of the production value and just how far he was going to go and how unique the experiences were and how they were all catered to people's own unique fears. Now it's just Russ on his farm, and for most people who sign up for this experience, they walk around. Well, walk around isn't the right word. They crawl around with a barrel on their back for a little bit. They go through chicken wire and get water sprayed on them. If they're lucky, they get to go into some kind of cheap saw knockoff contraption in the barn. But for a lot of people, they don't even get that. They don't even get to go to the barn. There is no manor. It's more like McKamey Farm. And that's not really, it doesn't really have the same ring to it now, does it? And he definitely doesn't have $20,000 to give because he's just running this operation with pennies pretty much. And the reputation that McKamey Manor has is built based off of what it was in the past. And it's not what it is now. And the documentary didn't even talk about that. It didn't show that contrast, and I think it should have. That really would have been an eye opener. It would have been like, oh, look at how infamous and how insane and how crazy and how disturbing this whole experience was. And you get why people would want this extreme haunt. And then, bam, just people stumbling around on the farm with barrels on their backs and getting sprayed with water, and Russ saying you can't even go in the barn. The manor is closed today. Like, that would have been a great contrast, but they didn't go there. They didn't do that. And they also didn't do the extra amount of research that they should have, because they would find out the $20,000 is a hoax. It was never legit. Nobody was ever going to win $20,000. It was all just something that he set up as a way to advertise and hype up his experience. He didn't have $10,000 to give people, let alone $20,000. And on top of that, he lied to people. He lied to people in order to get them to go to the manor. So there's an extra amount of manipulation going on here that you would think would probably involve the authorities even more, because people signed a waiver. But at the same time, a lot of these people who went to the manor, they weren't all just people who wanted some kind of extreme haunt experience. There's a lot of people who went to the manor and got tortured who flat out just were lied to. Russ said that, oh, it's like Indiana Jones on steroids. Oh, I got all these rope bridges and zip lines. It'll be a blast. And then they go to the manor, they go to his farm, and they just get a barrel put on their back, asked to go around and walk around or crawl around on the grass of the barrel like there's some kind of drunken, stumbling turtle, and then get sprayed with water. You're like, yeah, that's not at all what I signed up for. So, and these are all things that Reckless Ben in his YouTube series expose legitimately. And this documentary didn't even do that, didn't even mention that. So I definitely did feel that was a bit disappointing, that it wasn't as detailed as it could have been in terms of the research. And like I said, I would have liked to have seen other perspectives from different people who worked with Russ or other fans of Russ and what their thoughts are instead of these cherry-picked Facebook videos. But those were definitely some of the more upsetting parts of the film to me, was just like the interviews at the end, or not really the interviews, but like the people who were sending in videos to Russ talking about how they want to do the manor and they want to do the whole experience. Like this one woman who's a registered nurse. I'm like, you're a registered nurse and you're advocating for this, where people are actually getting hurt and having their teeth ripped out and showing up in the hospital with all kinds of bruises and abrasions and injuries. And you're like, yeah, this is awesome. This is great. Go do it. Like, maybe you shouldn't be a nurse anymore. If you're like, yeah, I can't wait to do the manor. The manor is awesome. Everybody's talking shit about the manor is wrong. You just need to have some balls and need to be able to survive it. But I want to do it, man. And I'm like, lady, you're a nurse. What are you doing? You're going against everything that you stand for. Like, you're supposed to be wanting to help people and advise people against this kind of stuff, not tell people, hey, go out and injure yourself in a torture dungeon because it'll be fun. But yeah, that's the kind of perspective that I think added a little extra to the documentary, but there's not so much of it. There's not a ton of it, so it still does come across as pretty one-sided. And you know what's crazy is Russ was interviewed in another documentary about haunts in the past. It was called Haunters: The Art of the Scare. And honestly, I like that a little bit more. I would recommend checking that out if you're interested in this kind of thing, because there's a nice contrast to this documentary, because this is when Russ was still married to his wife. You get interviews with his wife. He seems like he's less unhinged in that. And it also shows that he was willing to do interviews. Like he did an interview for that and even showed the behind the scenes and the process of making one of his haunts for one session. So it shows that he's a little more open minded than the documentary filmmakers for this film made him out to be. Also, that had other haunts that were featured in it. And I think that that's kind of for the best. Like if you don't have that extra layer of detail, if you don't have those extra different perspectives when it comes to McKamey Manor, and you don't have a lot that is that different from what's already on the internet when it comes to this topic, then there's not a lot there. So I think the best way is to have it as a part of a whole that features multiple different other haunts, which is what Haunters is. And this documentary, like, yeah, it definitely does show that this is pretty extreme and pretty intense and pretty crazy, but it also doesn't show the reality of it. That a lot of this is just editing. A lot of this is Russ getting that money shot. Like they mentioned that Russ is doing all this stuff and he keeps torturing people until they hit their limit because he wants that money shot, but they don't really show that sometimes he doesn't ever get a money shot, or if he does, there's so much other footage that's just completely boring and not even scary and not even intense and not even anything. And it shows that a lot of his streams and a lot of everything that he's utilized to build this brand is is a bunch of bullshit. It's false promises and pretenses about the $20,000 prize, which he never had, was never going to give anybody. The lies about, hey, it's going to be Indiana Jones on steroids, and then it's just some lame series of tasks to do at his farm or stuff that happens at the manor. And you don't really get all the other stuff in terms of how he's not following certain codes nowadays, how he's being investigated, like because that's happening right now. The local authorities and the government are actually investigating McKamey Manor right now because of the efforts of Reckless Ben and his colleagues who actually went out and made an effort to try to get information, figure out if he's violating certain codes like fire codes, and then send them to the governments. And now there's investigations that are happening. This documentary just mentions that an investigation is possible, but doesn't really, talk about one that could potentially happen or what the kind of investigation would be other than, oh, well, if people are harmed psychologically or physically, that even if they sign a waiver, then that doesn't technically mean that the person who tortured them or hurt them can get away scot free. So yeah, it's one of those documentaries where it's got an interesting topic, but it's not as interesting of a documentary as a whole because of just various different things that it just doesn't quite get right, or it just misses completely. So I would say if the concept and the idea of it does interest you, go ahead and give it a watch sometime. But I would also recommend checking out Reckless Ben's videos. They're a lot of fun. He has a completely different perspective. It's definitely more comedic. There's even one video where he just straight up trolls Russ and tortures him in a different game. Like he tricks Russ into basically being a part of his own torture, but it's more of a cringe kind of torture, but it's still very satisfying. Um, and when it comes to my personal opinions on Russ, I think the guy is damaged and he's completely screwed in the head, and I think he needs to go get some help. And I think he really needs to think about stop taking advantage of equally as damaged people because that's one of the things that really came across to me in this documentary. When it comes to all the people that are interviewed, they are people with issues. They are deep rooted issues from childhood, resulting from abandonment, resulting from being ostracized because of their sexuality, or in one man's case, genuine PTSD from multiple tours in Iraq. And so there's some very real issues that these people are dealing with. And the last thing that they need is some guy who has his own issues doubling down on those issues by taking things too far when it comes to his experience that he does, definitely for him to get off. Because at this point, when you see the footage, like it's him getting off. He's getting off on this. It's a power trip, and it's the epitome of a sociopath. So, uh, sociopaths and pretty much anyone don't. I mean, extreme sociopaths anyway. There are some levels of sociopathy that are different than others that are less extreme, but he seems to be pretty extreme. And so, if you have people who have genuine psychological trauma to begin with, they don't need a guy who has extreme sociopathy to just trigger even more things or make things even worse. It's just a really bad combo, and it's very dangerous. And even though his manner nowadays is an absolute pathetic joke, the fact that he did all this psychological damage and physical damage to people, it's no joke. And I genuinely do hope that this investigation just ends this all for good, because it's for even for the people who had a good experience or thought it was awesome. There are so many other things that you could do with your time and your money that get you more uh, uh, enjoyment or more out of it, and they won't necessarily cause this kind of damage, and they don't have this kind of risk where, well, what if this guy goes too far and snaps one time, has a mental breakdown while he's doing one of these sessions, so to speak, and somebody dies? Like, that's a real possibility because of just how much of a sociopath he is. Um, and how he has what seems like some psychopathic tendencies. So when that happens, like, what if he has a break? Or like they mentioned, like, what if he has a health problem and he's doing all this other stuff, and well, they're in the middle of nowhere and there's nowhere for them to go, so somebody could easily die. So yeah, it might seem like it's over the top and it's just theatrics, and in some ways it is, but there's a very cold and hard reality when it comes to the monster inside of Russ McKamey. And at the very least, despite how mediocre this documentary is, I do feel that it's bringing more people's eyes and ears on McKamey Manor and Russ McKamey and what he's doing and what he's done. And for that reason alone, I think this documentary was, for the most part, a success. But anyway, thanks for watching my thoughts on Monster Inside. And until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.